Yeah, I just want to ask you about the taxi and private hire trade and your regulation of that part of the transport system. Um, what will you encourage the new TfL Commissioner to prioritise with regard to the taxi and private hire trade?
So I think both, well, first of all, I would just say that the black cab trade in London has a significant part to play in London's economy and in helping move people around the city, as does the private hire trade in terms of the work it does and contributes to as well. I think we have seen some real changes in the last few years, particularly in terms of trying to ensure that black cabs are greener and that the modern zero emission capable vehicles are rolled out. I'm delighted that we've seen an increasing uptake in the zero emission capable vehicle and in fact the additional additive effect of the Nissan Dynamo, which is now being commissioned as well, will I'm sure make a further contribution as well. Of course, the Taxi and Private Hire Action Plan was designed also to do important things like raise the profile of the knowledge, to explore options for accreditation, and we continue to look at this closely. We continue to try and promote people to take up roles as taxi drivers in our city. And also, of course, we've been trying to support the trade, both trades, by ensuring that we give whatever support we can for the fact that we need to have cleaner vehicles on our city streets.
You mentioned the zero emission capable taxis,
Yeah.
and since January 2018, there hasn't been a choice for taxi drivers. They've been forced to purchase the TXE for 2 years, which was vastly more expensive than the TX4. Do you have any regrets about how that was rolled out and the effect that had on taxi drivers?
Well, I don't have any regrets from the process to try and clean up London's air quality, because I think we all accept that's the right thing to do. I think it's also true to say that the support that we put in place, so by 6th of January this year, we made 2,054 delicensing payments for the owners of older, more polluting taxis. You can still, by the way, apply to these payments of up to £8,000. And I also think there is a balance to be made in terms of the upfront cost of a new vehicle, which I do understand your point, but also the operational cost of running a zero-emission capable taxi. The operational cost is significantly lower. So over a period of time, this is a more economic as well as a cleaner, greener option for London.
But that does depend on the availability of charging points and the price of electricity from those charging points as well. And one of the sort of concerns that taxi drivers have is that there aren't enough charging points. Sometimes they're very, very expensive. And also, they might get to a dedicated charging point and someone else is in there. And there doesn't seem to be much policing of who's using the charging points, and so it's no good having dedicated taxi charging points when other drivers park there and use them, and then taxi drivers can't use them and they can't charge up their vehicles. So what are you doing to address those issues?
It's a very fair question. So the 226 new rapid charging points across London, 73 of those are taxi dedicated. Obviously, we continue to work with private landowners and the London boroughs to increase the numbers of these. Taxi dedicated rapid charging points are clearly signed. There's road markings saying taxi only. The Metropolitan Police Service and our own road traffic enforcement officers patrol red routes on a regular basis. So again, trying to enforce against contraventions, and indeed 232 penalty charge notices have been issued to date for non-compliance in electric vehicle bay. By the way, I'm also exploring mobile CCTV enforcement for electric vehicle bays as well, as part of all of this future activity, because the taxi trade has raised this issue with me, as I'm sure you'll be aware. The other thing I would say, though, just in terms of the evidence, because we do know whether people are having to wait when they get to a rapid charging point. Very few rapid charging points are experience any queues at all for people to charge up. There are some specific examples that are challenges. Southwark Street is one example where there is a challenge, and we're doing some specific work around that and enforcement, and that includes working with the City of London on Baynard House, just over the river, to ensure that it becomes a recharging hub in the fullness of time, because I think that's also got to be part of the model going forward. So although there is some apocryphal stories about people having to wait to get their vehicle charged. Actually, the reality from the evidence, because we know how often these are being used, is that some of them are being used actually very little of the time, and they are in quite strategically convenient places as well.
Okay. Now, the other thing you mentioned was cleaning up the taxi fleet.
Yeah.
Do you consider Euro 6 diesel vehicles to be clean?
I consider that if you retrofit to Euro 6 vehicles on buses, then that technology is shown to deliver an improved air quality standard, and we've done that. We'll have the whole of the bus fleet delivered to that standard by the year. There is a different scale of Euro 6 that's capable for taxis, which isn't the same and actually is more polluting for taxis in terms of retrofit. And what I don't want to do is, if I had an ability right now to buy a bus fleet from scratch, I wouldn't buy even Euro 6. I'd buy totally electric, subject to manufacturing capability. And the same goes for bringing in any new vehicles onto the fleet of taxis going forward.
How about private hire vehicles?
Yeah.
Because you still allow private hire vehicles and via vans, on-demand buses to use new vehicles to be Euro 6.
Well, so on-demand buses, just to be clear on that situation, the on-demand buses aren't, the trials that we've had in both Sutton and Ealing, they're not coming into central London. They're actually only trials, as we say, with the Mercedes Vito vehicles for on-demand buses, and they're not even coming into what would be the ultra-low emission zone extension. The challenge with private hire vehicles has been in the way that they operate, is them coming into London and often patrolling around.
Do you consider them to be clean?
Well, I think the point is they're no longer exempt from the congestion charge. They're no longer exempt from they're not exempt from the ultra low emission zone. So if they're not clean, they will be paying appropriately. But 77% of vehicles coming into the ultra low emission zone, as I said earlier on, are compliant vehicles. So the interventions of both carrot and stick have helped in this regard.
Well, are you going to, in the future, insist that private hire vehicles will be zero emission capable as well?
Well, they will in the fullness of time, because we've seen the government announcement today, and we've seen the reality of the ultra low emission zone extension.
What do you mean by the fullness of time?
Well, okay, so the ultra low emission zone, coming in next year, the extension will of course improve the situation still further. So there will be a real imperative for operators of public-private hire vehicles to be cleaner and greener. And you know, when I talk to the private hire vehicle trade, by the way, they are absolutely determined to work with us in this regard.
There was I think, a plan to make the private hire vehicle fleet zero emission capable from 2023. Is that still your plan? I
believe it is, yes. I'll double check and confirm that with you. Right. I believe it is, yeah.
Okay, that would be the fullness of time then,
yeah.
I imagine. You did then mention the congestion charge in relation to private hire vehicles. What are your plans for the congestion charge exemption in taxis?
I have no plans.
Okay, fine. And what are your prospects for progress on the regulation of pedicabs in London?
Well, it's a very good point. In fact, we were just talking about this the other day. This has been an ongoing challenge to get legislative time to achieve that. Actually, when I was talking about e-scooters earlier on, we have now just given some consideration of whether there might be an opportunity, and if there's going to be some legislative conditions applied to that type of new technology, whether we re-explore with the government the whole issue of pedicabs, where we all want to sort it out, but it's always been a problem to get any legislative opportunity so to do. So, I do hope we'll make some progress.
Well, there really needs to be a whole new legislation, an act that covers taxis, private hire.
There absolutely does, and in fact we've been waiting for some time for this, and of course the challenges of the some wider issues that the government has been facing, I think, have prevented that getting the airtime it needs. But I'm optimistic now that we will get the opportunity to bring that forward, or for the government to bring that forward in legislative.
It does seem that there's a government with a majority now, so things are perhaps more able to move forward in Parliament. But since the election, have you had any discussions with any parliamentarians?
Well, I've met, as I said, I've met with transport ministers, and this is part of the dialogue that we'll continue to have. But we absolutely continue to push it. And as I said, we were just talking internally the other day about what mechanism we may seek to support them with from a pedicab perspective particularly.
Okay, thank you. Now one of the other things that has been an issue over the last 4 years or so is Uber. And why have TfL's disputes with Uber been so hard to resolve?
Have been, sorry?
Hard to resolve.
Well, I think you need to ask private hire operators that question rather than me. I mean, we have a very clear regulatory responsibility. It is absolutely incumbent on private hire operators, whoever they are, to comply with the regulatory standards that we expect of them. And I will be unapologetic for putting passenger safety at the core of everything with regard to the regulatory decisions made. And that is a decision reserved to TfL. It's not a political decision. The Mayor doesn't make such a decision. It is entirely made by the regulatory team within my organisation, quite rightly so. And we will continue to be ensuring the highest standards of operational apply.
No, I absolutely agree with you on that decision. But there are alternative operators and perhaps new big operators coming into the private hire market in London very soon. How are you ensuring and how will you continue to ensure that alternative large private hire operators will be safe to use?
Well, we will apply exactly the same rigour with them, whoever they are, as we apply to existing operators.
Okay, thanks. Now, one of the ideas that's been floated is developing a charter mark, which would be some kind of voluntary accreditation scheme for private hire operators. What are your thoughts on that?
I think there may be some merit in that. I think it's not necessarily a bad thing to do. I think what I'd like to do is get through this current regulatory cycle, if you like, and then review that in the fullness of time going forward. Whatever the courts decide will be a matter for the courts, of course, since it now is in legal process. But I do think that we need to recognise the different paradigm we now have with new entrants, as you allude to, and with the way technology has developed in the last few years.
Now, staying with private hire vehicles, the number of private hire vehicles on London's roads or being licensed has increased by 19,000 over the last 4 years, from 78,000 to 97,000 vehicles. There's a clear need to try to reduce that number, because obviously it causes congestion, among other things. What recommendations will you make to the new Commissioner regarding efforts to reduce the number of private hire vehicles on the road?
Well, it's not, of course, something that we have free rein to do anything about at the moment. It's not in the legislation. It's not something we have control over. I think this goes back to the legislative framework overall that I was talking about a few minutes ago, that we need to really get some certainty on issues, for example, like cross-border hiring, because again, there is the reality that London, there isn't, when I last checked, a border of any sort between London and immediately outside London, and therefore the number of, even if we were to have control about the number of vehicles we could license, private hire vehicles we could license in London, of course it's now going to stop operators from outside London coming in. So this needs to be looked at in the round, and that but I do think that this is the recalibration of this market is something we need to be very aware of, and given our quest for an increased modal share for walking, cycling and public transport, clearly it is of concern. Equally, of course, I do recognise that unless and until we make further inroads into transport provision in Outer London, decent public transport provision in all parts of Outer London, some of which are brilliantly served already, and we're making progress, but then there will always be a demand for some of these private hire services to operate. So, I have nothing against the private hire vehicle sector at all, quite the reverse. They play an important role to play as well in parts of London where black cabs perhaps don't penetrate as much, but we do have to make sure we look at this in the round from a legislative control perspective, levers of which we don't have at our disposal right now.
Right, okay, thank you. The final thing I want to ask you about is something I have asked you about before, which is the knowledge of London, which is vital for training new taxi drivers. The number of taxi drivers is down, the number of taxi vehicles in the fleet is down by 2,500 since 2016. So there's an urgent need to promote the knowledge and support new entrants to the taxi trade. So what are you going to do to promote the knowledge of London and make progress on getting accreditation for it?
Yeah, so, well, you're quite right, and we do need to promote the knowledge of London. This is still a great a great career for people to embark on. So a key recommendation of the Taxi and Private Hire Action Plan, as I've said, was to raise the profile of the knowledge. So we've published a brochure, as you probably know, How to Become a London Taxi Driver. This includes specific case studies of students from different backgrounds who've successfully gone through the knowledge of London process. It's available on our website. And I think we want to continue to support the dedicated, disciplined people who do operate taxis in our cities, and make sure that we continue to support them in what they are, after all, already proving to be, which is the best of their type anywhere in the world. So we'll continue to make inroads. I continue to meet personally with the representatives of the taxi trade, and I will continue to get feedback and input from them in this regard as well.
I would respect, Commissioner, I mean, making a brochure is fine, but number of people who are doing the knowledge, the number of people going into the trade has fallen off a cliff and it isn't recovering. So I think you need to do more than just make a brochure. I think you need to actually get going on accrediting the knowledge, so that people who study the knowledge will have access to finance and schemes that will support them. So can you say something more, because this is quite urgent?
So we are actively looking at options for accreditation. We're continuing to look at this closely. Of course, we have to ensure that the standard is preserved, because none of us wants to dilute the standard of the knowledge going forward. It is something that makes it as unique as it is, but within that context, we are actively exploring those options for accreditation. So we'll continue to do what we can. I mean, we don't have direct control of all the levers here, and of course, when you've got a pretty much full employment economy, this is a challenging time for trying to get more people to be taxi drivers, the same way as it is to get more bus drivers or get more tube drivers or anything else. But we'll continue to do whatever we can. I'm always grateful for your input and thoughts on this matter.
Okay, thank you.